She's a senior fellow of the Estes Park Institute in the areas of, get this, futures, innovation, and wisdom cultures.
Woo, yeah.
She serves as a hospital trustee, has been a board member of other organizations, including the VHA Health Foundation. She began her career working in hospitals, attained her master's in health administration, and rapidly became one of the youngest and most recognized health futurists in the industry. I think that's all wonderful and just exquisite, but it doesn't mention her incredible heart. And that's what we've been so benefited by over these years. I've just felt like she's someone that has held the heart of this organization. And to bring her back at this point at the naming, and when we first contacted you, that had not unfolded yet, except it really had, I think. It had already done that, and perhaps she initiated that in 2007. So I would love you to give her the most amazing, lotus-hearted welcome that you can conceive of, and bring your full heart and awareness and spirit to our first keynote, Leanne Kaiser Carlson.
What an honor. I remember the last time I was with you. Quite a journey. I think in light of what just happened, we need a different opening story. A story about borders and boundaries. It's one of my favorites. There was a high school superintendent, actually a church school superintendent, and he was visiting one of the very small schools out in the countryside, and he sat in one of the lower grades in the back, just watching the class. And the teacher was teaching and asked the question to the classroom, "Who tore down the walls of Jericho?" And little Johnny in the back immediately popped up his arm and said, "I don't know, but it wasn't me." Well, the superintendent was kind of amused, but also aghast, and relayed this to the school principal later. And the principal said, "You know, I know Johnny and his whole family. If he says he didn't do it, I believe that's the truth." All right, now it was no longer funny, and so the superintendent went to the regional head of education, aghast at this lack of basic biblical knowledge, relayed both stories. And the regional head of education said, "You know, I don't get why this is such a big deal." He said, "Why don't you get 2 bids and get the wall fixed?" Oh my. I love your name because I think it does represent the future. Can we really imagine a world without borders? When the wall is as distant of a memory as those walls of Jericho. When we can't remember the dividing line between Democrat and Republican, between one nation and another. We take these things so seriously. Between organizations and ideologies and all of the boundaries that make us feel so safe and so contained, but ultimately so limited. It's a good name because the universe has no boundaries. You got to look really hard. It's getting bigger. And your theme, Journey into Wholeness, really captures that. The universe is bigger today than it was yesterday. For everything that is known, there's more now that is unknown. I love that. The idea that we'll never reach the edge, we'll never reach the limit. Imagine if this really was all there was. If we came to the border and realized, okay, now we know it all. there's nowhere to go. We just reached the summit of that mountaintop and there's no more vista. It's what I love about climbing the mountains here in Colorado. You know, you think you see the top, but then you get to the top, and inevitably there's another top and another horizon. To me, that creates a feeling of incredible awe, a sense of belonging, a sense of being connected to something that is much larger. Now, there's moments when we all forget. When the car that's in front of us in traffic, or, yes, this one's a favorite, or the project, or whatever it is, becomes the whole world. But ultimately, I think we're always lifting up. I was at a restaurant here a few nights ago, and the waitress came over. You couldn't really see it from our table yet, but the moon was rising. And she said, "Can you see the moon? You gotta look. Pretty soon it's coming up over this building." It was a beautiful full moon. Sometimes we look up and we realize, yep, it's bigger. We're always going to be moving beyond some border, some boundary, reinventing, rebirthing, and recreating. And that's life. That's its essence. That's forever. That's the journey that we never end. You know, the problems that we get ourselves into are usually because we fall in love with a piece, with some contained box. Something that's too small, and we get our eyes on that and we lose sight of other things that are just as important. Maybe we are focusing on GDP and we get so focused on that and so obsessed with that we don't even realize we lost a forest. Or we're focused on our career and, oh my goodness, what happened to my child or my spouse? The errors that we make, the big ones, aren't usually errors of fact. They're errors of perspective. It's because we didn't see things in a big enough context. So the decision that seemed like it made sense all of a sudden doesn't make so much sense because we realized what happened to another piece we weren't watching. It's like when they introduced the rabbits into Australia. It seemed like a good idea. Some of you who are from there or who have been there, they remember well. Rabbits for hunting. Except they proliferated to such a great extent that now it accounts for the greatest species loss on that whole continent. Seen in context, seen in wholeness, lots of things that may have seemed wise or intelligent in a smaller scale, maybe not so much. So as a futurist, one of the things that you really realize, and I think we're all futurists to a great extent, we're all understanding where the future is taking us and shaping it. This is an art that we all practice. But what we realize is that it's not knowledge that saves us. It's not technology. That in fact, without the right perspective, those are actually really dangerous. You worry a lot. Do we have the wisdom? Do we have the perspective that we need? You know, since yesterday at this time, how many of you were here yesterday? So if you remember where you were last night about this time, we've lost 134 species. Plant species, animal species, they're not coming back. 200,000 acres of rainforest. That's since yesterday. 13 million tons of toxic chemicals that we're releasing into the environment since yesterday. So you wonder, are we going to get wise enough? Are we going to get high enough vantage point that we can see systemically enough to make the decisions that will take us to a different future? That is the entire crux of real healing and, I think, real futures work. We will get what we deserve. We will get what we create. Wholeness has such beauty. And I think if we fall in love again with wholeness, if we recapture that sense of awe of you not being really so different than me, of that problem or that plant or that possibility that's halfway around the world feeling like it's right here in my backyard, if we care about it in the same way, we're going to be okay. We have the potential. We have the intelligence. We have the technology to do extraordinary things. What a great time to live. Yeah. Reports reach the Dalai Lama that a certain master of Kung Fu was roaming the countryside, converting young men to the study of violence. He had gained quite a reputation, this master of Kung Fu, because he was attacked on a mountain pass by 8 fierce Lolo warriors, and he killed 7 of them so quickly that the one who survived with only broken legs swore that this Kung Fu master's movements were so swift that it appeared like he just walked through them peacefully on his way. Wherever he went, he gathered quite a following. People had heard. They were fascinated by his techniques. And the master of Kung Fu was happy to perform the dance of destruction in slow motion before an audience so they could see. Because done swiftly, it would appear that he was standing completely still. Only a rush of wind would indicate that he had spun about, throwing his arms and his legs so that at least a dozen young men were grabbing various parts of their body, playfully flicked by the master of Kung Fu to indicate which bones he could have broken, which organs he could have destroyed. Many of the monks were abandoning their robes and were wearing the tight black leather outfits that the master of Kung Fu was wearing. They were challenging themselves to duels, a lot of which were ending in injury or even death. Now, it was a custom, if someone claimed spiritual privilege or intent, to invite them to an audience with the Dalai Lama. And so an invitation was extended. Pleased with this invitation, the master of Kung Fu strode into the ceremonial hall. He was dashing, incredibly handsome. He had wavy blue-black hair that kind of fell down his shoulders. He didn't prostrate himself, he simply bowed gallantly. And then he spoke first, and he said, "I know why you have invited me, and I want you to stop worrying. Ugliness is my only enemy. I would never think of harming you." Well, said the Dalai Lama, when you want to do harm, what kind of harm can you do? Well, perhaps the best way to show you, said the master of Kung Fu, is to have you stand here in front of me while I perform this little dance that it took me 15 years to master. The Dalai Lama stood and felt this quick flash of wind, but he didn't see a thing. And so he said to the master of Kung Fu, "You may proceed." "Proceed," said the master of Kung Fu. "I'm already done. What you felt was the flicking of my hands to indicate which organs I could have destroyed, what injury I could have done." He said, "With this knuckle, I could have severed the contact between spine and brain. With my fingertip, I could have left you impotent. With my toe, I could have broken your arm, while breaking your leg in the same motion with my heel." He said, "Eyes, ears, throat, spleen, liver," he said, "I could have destroyed them all in this one little dance." And then he kind of looked approvingly at himself and said, "In order for beauty to arise, the demons of ugliness must be destroyed." And he began to describe all manner of corruption in the city where he had grown up. The Dalai Lama paused for a minute, and then he said, I know a master who is greater than you. Well, without meaning to insult you, Your Highness, said the master of Kung Fu, I sincerely doubt that. He said, but bring him in, and if he beats me, I shall leave Tibet forever. If he bests you, the Dalai Lama said, you will have no need to leave Tibet. The Dalai Lama looked around at the monks to see if they were as confident as he was. And they were all looking very disconsolate, furtively glancing away, hoping that he wasn't planning on one of them, because they were sure this was going to end in defeat. The Dalai Lama clapped his hands and said, Regent, summon the dancing master. And he says, while we wait for him to arrive, we shall have tea. Which they did. Soon the dancing master came in the door. He was a small, wiry fellow, clearly past his prime. He must have been half the size of the master of Kung Fu. His joints were swollen. He had lived long. And in many ways, he appeared very frail, but his eyes were sparkling, and you could tell he appeared eager. The master of Kung Fu sized him up, and he thought, he assumed a jaunty stance and invited the dancing master to strike him first. He didn't want to discredit him too much. He said, my own master was a man just as old as you. He said, until a few years ago was the first time that I could beat him. He said he was so fast. But in his mind, he thought, okay. The old dancing master began to swirl. The robes kind of wafted around his head, and his arms moved outstretched. His hands floated like butterflies, and he touched the brow just above the eye of the master of Kung Fu when he jumped back. For the master of Kung Fu, all of a sudden the room appeared different. It was vibrant color. The faces of the monks appeared to glow. They had never looked so beautiful. Everything was lighted. It was like his eyes had been washed clean for the first time. And then the dancing master brushed lightly the nose of the master of Kung Fu, and all of a sudden he could smell. He could smell butter melting in the most fragrant of teas. He could smell the barley from the granary that was far below in the city. It was like his whole body was humming and buzzing. He could hear the sound of 1,000 longhorns. It was like the dancing master, every time he touched him, he was assaulting his body with joy. And the master of Kung Fu opened his mouth and he began to sing like a bird in the morning. And then the master of Kung Fu began to turn, began to swirl, and then began the most beautiful dance they had ever seen in that ceremonial hall. It lasted 3 days and 3 nights. People gathered in the doorways. There was feasting, there was celebration. The entire community gathered to witness what was happening. It was only after that 3rd day when the master of Kung Fu collapsed in front there of where the Dalai Lama was. And it was only then that he realized there was another body beside his. The old dancing master had died, giving his most glorious dance. He died happy, having found the student that he always longed for. And the new dancing master of Tibet took up his frail corpse, breathed the last of his energy into his body. Never had he felt that strong. beauty, awe, an openness to life will take us where no amount of power, no amount of force, no amount of strategy ever will. And so the theme of your conference that you chose, Into Greater Wholeness, I think is how we fall in love again with everything. I want to look with you at 3 aspects of wholeness. We'll spend a little time on the personal. We're going to explore a few organizational applications, and then we will end up looking at it from a planetary perspective. One of the most fascinating things about wholeness at a personal level is that we're much more than is an expression. We're much more than is manifest. I find this incredibly hopeful. There's more coming. Just wait, there's more coming. The physicist David Bohm described this as a pattern that's enfolded in on itself, that is infinite, that will forever be unfolding. The pattern that is you, that unique spark, is infinite. You will discover it forever. You will be more like you next month, next year, 1,000 years. My father used to say to me, if you could see yourself 1,000 years from now, you would be terrified. And he meant like in awe. Now, I'm terrified when I look in the mirror in the morning, but I don't think that's what he meant. It's like you would not recognize because you would be so different. I have as a personal goal to be unrecognizable every few years. We'll check back in on that, see how it's coming along. But really, if we're growing, if we're moving into more of ourselves, shouldn't we be? Yes. Absolutely. What a shame when someone's life stops at age 20 or age 30, and then it's just kind of a trajectory. No, that's not how it was meant to be at all. There's a lot of mystery behind this, and part of the mystery is that we only bring in from our wholeness what is needed to do the work we have to do in our life. More than that would be an interference, an encumbrance. It would make it harder for us to do what we need to do and to learn what we need to learn. So some of your gifts you left kind of setting on the shelf, which is a nice thing to think about. There are ways that those will kind of be drawn in, and we'll think a little bit about that. But part of the basic idea here is that at the level of pattern, there is an infinite extensibility for each one of us. Now, unfortunately, when you come into life, you don't come in with an owner's manual, and that is a shame. Because people stand around the crib and they guess at what this thing is. And they say, well, its dad was a doctor, it must be a doctor. Or its father and its great-grandfather were farmers, I think we have a farmer. A lot of people spend their whole life trying to become who they're not. I would venture to guess that when you are working with patients, with clients, that often you sense some aspect of their being that may not be evident to anyone else. True? I think it's one of the most incredible dimensions of the work you do. It's not only what you do at an energetic level, it's what happens in terms of your ability to sense the wholeness of a person and to help birth that, really. I'm working with 2 CFOs right now. One of them, they both have kind of interesting patterns with this. Of course, everyone in the organization, when you're a chief financial officer, both of these individuals were viewed as the most linear, always say no, stuck in the mud, stodgy individuals. But I'll tell you, the first time I saw one of them, I thought, oh my goodness, this guy has heart. He has more heart than anyone else on this executive team. Go figure. How do we call forward? How do we give permission for him as the chief financial officer to lead with that aspect, which happens to be, I think, even more magnificent than his financial ability by quite a bit. As he has stepped into that, it has been a wonder to behold. This chief financial officer now runs all of the HR department. I mean, he still does finance, but he also oversees human resources. Isn't that amazing? The other one is very similar. I won't share the story, but do you remember the research years ago when teachers were told certain things about students which happened actually not to be true? Do you remember this? For example, very gifted students, they were said, this guy's a little slow, but, be patient. We think he can make it with enough extra attention. Or children who really were more challenged in their learning, where they would tell the teacher, I know it doesn't show in the obvious ways, but this is one of the highest potential children we've ever tested. And, they would essentially create this story in the mind of the teachers, and you remember what happened. They lived into it. The greatest gift you'll ever give another person is when you sense some aspect of their wholeness, of their beauty, of their potential. And the more aware you are at the subtlest levels of your being, the more you will perceive. You will often sense things that are not evident to the person themselves. Sometimes we all need that. Someone to say, I just sense something in you. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I can feel it there. It gives it life, just like that teacher did. Well, that's an amazing journey that we will take, kind of discovering and becoming a bit more of who we are. Now, it's not just what we carry at an individual level. And there are times when, because of the work you do, certain gifts will descend that are those ones that are on the shelf or that are carried at a soul level. But there's something else happening here as well. Part of our wholeness is what we carry from everyone who went before us. We carry, at the level of pattern, the ability to access. It doesn't mean we can necessarily manifest it all, but it is there within us. Everything that was developed by all of our ancestors going back in time. And everything that was unresolved. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's focus on the fun part, which is the gifts, the things that someone in your lineage worked incredibly hard for. May be accessible to you with hardly any work at all. This is what sometimes happens with what we call child prodigies, right? Some of you have seen this, but just for fun, for those of you who haven't seen it. Yeah. How many of you have not seen this? About half. Okay. Those of you who have will enjoy it. So this kid, and I apologize, this isn't the highest quality video. It is, yes, indeed, a YouTube video. This kid is 4 years old.
彈多次 First Time 就有5000分。俾啲表情啦。
This is my favorite part, actually.
收拾心情，收拾心情。好激昂㗎，好激昂嘅，知唔知啊？每一下要撞硬啲石頭。喂。
I just don't think you get that through piano lessons. Sometimes when those capacities come out through the line and they are fully developed, they're sitting right on the surface. It's incredible to behold. And there are so many. I mean, we could have done a dozen of these. Mathematical prodigies, musical prodigies, athletic prodigies. I mean, kids who are bringing in stuff you don't get in 4 years of life. You know, one of the nice things is it says that part of who we are, we won't discover till a long ways down the road. But there's also an incredible gratitude for things that each of us is able to do that actually we didn't fully earn. Someone before us paid a little bit of that, earned a little bit of that, so that, in fact, we are able to do it. Now, the other part of this is that which is unresolved also sits there. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but in the womb, we can, and there are images of this, where the infant will grab the cord and essentially oxygen deprive him or herself. They're thrill seekers. Seriously. It's happening in the womb. This is the closest equivalent to Elitch's or an amusement park ride, the roller coaster, or anger, or dispositions to a whole lot of other things. I mean, kids who come out and, the anger, there's no reason to be that angry at 12 months old or 6 months old. Well, that's the same thing. And sometimes we come into family lines solely to help clear that. There's a physical DNA that we hear a lot about, but there are correlates of that at the mental level, at the emotional level, and at the spiritual level. It was actually yesterday, I think it was in the New York Times. It was either yesterday or the day before. They had an article on how even ideologies and ways of thinking appear to have a genomic component to it. It was a really crazy bit of research. Well, there's more than we think. And so a couple of things. One is, wouldn't it be great to sit down with a child and help them understand their lineage? Because often they identify with it. I must be bad. I am angry. Instead, we could say, you are a child of the divine, but you are carrying unresolved anger from in your past. It's not actually you, but you may be the one who clears it. You may be the one who decides it's going to end with me. You may be the one who, and when you clear it, this part resides outside of time, so you clear it all the way back and all the way forward in your family line. This piece of you, so wholeness, has more dimensionality to it than we often realize, and it's the pattern that exists that is us, part of which is outside of time as we understand it. That is what initiates synchronicities. It's why sometimes just the right learning or just the right thing that we need comes in. It's actually resonating, if you will, with a part of us, a part of the pattern. I'm sure you have observed that people that you work with in your healing work who have stuff, and we all have stuff, just a little different package, how it attracts life circumstance, how the same scenario seems to come into their life. A little different cast of characters, same plot. That's because of the resonance that's there. And the deepest aspect of resonance is the pattern of who we are. That is the implicate order. That is our blueprint. That is our essence. Now, one of the things that we know about this is that when we extend ourselves for others, it accelerates our growth. In a way, probably how we should think about this is we want to forget ourselves in order to move beyond ourselves to finally become ourselves. That's quite a trajectory. In a way, we don't want to be focusing on it. That actually interferes. So it doesn't help to spend your whole life focused on who am I, really? It's actually better in many ways to forget about that, move beyond yourself, focus on the work you're trying to do for another, and in that process, we become who we really are. Spiritual gifts and abilities such as you all work with each day are different than others in that they are very connected to how we serve. And so the more we put ourselves in service to anything, you can serve a plant, you can serve a person, you can serve an ocean, you can serve a community. Service finally becomes not just what you do, it's just the way you choose to show up. Whether it's at Starbucks or wherever it is you are, it's the way in which you put yourself in the service of the becoming of whatever is around you. That is the most accelerated path of personal development that any of us will ever walk. There was a monk who was known for his wisdom. He very rarely gave people direct answers. Usually when people came to him, he would give them a question to think about. They would ask him a question, and he would give them back another question. But it turned out that this method of teaching was actually surprisingly effective. One day a priest came. He was there at this monastery on retreat, and he said to the monk, "I'm here on retreat, and I was wondering, could you give me a question to ponder?" The monk thought for a moment, and he said, "Yes." He said, "The question is, what do they need? What do they need?" The priest looked a little maybe disappointed, but he didn't say too much. He left. A couple hours later, though, he was back. And he said, maybe I didn't make myself clear. He said, "I'm actually here on my personal retreat to work on my personal development, not to really reflect on my calling as a priest." He said, "Maybe you could give me a question along those lines." The monk said, "Oh, well, sure. If that's the case, the question is, what do they really need?" One of the things we're finding, I do a lot of work with health systems, and one of the things we're finding is it is unhealthy. How many of you, by the way, do work in a hospital setting? Awesome. One of the things we're finding is it is unhealthy to always be on the receiving side. And we are classic at this in medicine. We have someone who is the healer or the physician or the nurse or the whatever it is, and someone who's the patient, who is the receiver, the recipient, the one being done to, the one that is passive, the one that is in need. Dangerous. And so when we have patients who actively give in any way of themselves to support other patients, like MS patients that support other MS patients, who benefits? Yep, the givers. It came as a surprise to researchers when they first started tracking this, because they thought that who would benefit were the patients who were getting the calls. There is now a stack of research on the healing power of generosity, of altruism. Yes, absolutely. If, there's a couple sites. If I can be present of mind here enough, I'll think of one of the people that has collected this. He's an incredible guy. Or email me. I will send it to you. There are others. But he periodically will do a review on all the literature about the healing benefits of altruism. It's terrific. In any case, we're using this in many places as a therapeutic modality. It is. I had a physical therapist friend years ago. She saw the absolute toughest patients. I mean, the revolving door, the people that no one could help, they all ended up with her. And she was also doing some work over in Africa in various really remote communities. And she started telling some of her patients about her travels, and a few of them ended up wanting to go with her. Ultimately, quite a number ended up going with her. And what do you suppose happened to their clinical pathologies? They shifted. They shifted. There's a woman named Cami Walker. Are any of you familiar with Cami? She wrote a book. She actually was one of these MS patients. And she had such a severe type of MS. It had ruined her career, which was very high profile. She ended up on so many pain medications and a whole array of other things. She had to go through detox, and her whole life began to revolve around everything she had lost, which you can understand. She was losing relationships, she'd lost her career, she'd lost control of her body, she was losing everything. And so, it became the focal point for every waking moment. One of her friends one day said, "Cami, I think for a few minutes each day, you need to think about something other than yourself." That was from a friend who had the courage to be honest. Cami thought about it, and sometime later, she said, "What the heck?" And she started a giving practice, and she resolved every day, I'm going to do something for someone to make their life better. Most of them didn't involve money at all. It was, maybe helping someone in some way, or encouragement, or, things that she could actually do. And the most amazing thing happened. Her relationship with her disease, which is not curable, but her relationship with her disease began to shift. And as that happened, then her experience of pain began to shift. This is a practice she's continued for many years. She has engaged tens of thousands of other patients in this giving practice. 22 days, where every day they do something to connect to the larger wholeness. So sometimes we just have to escape our own story. It's terrible to get caught in your own story, even good stories. Even good stories can become a prison. Sometimes we just need to break that boundary as well. From a future standpoint, I will tell you that this aspect of healing, we are now seeing what are called purpose-driven neighborhoods. Have you ever heard of it? This is one of the best trends, the most inspiring trends. Purpose-driven neighborhoods, where people live in these neighborhoods, in these sections of these communities, because they want to live life that is contributing to other people in some way. One of the first ones was created in what used to be an old Air Force base residential area. And the people who lived there were elders, so seniors, who had time and energy and were willing to mentor, foster kids, and single parents of foster kids who needed extra help. Compared, by the way, this has been years and years running now, they have a 100% graduation rate. Phenomenal. We're hovering usually in the 30% in the foster care system. Wholeness says there's always enough. The resource is there. We just don't connect it in the right way because we get caught in some small boundary, in some container, so we never put it together. Well, we become who we are in part because of our habitats. I mean, you could say habits, but that's actually habitats. And habitat design is a fascinating application of this that says the habitat, the space that we live in, must support the essence of who we are, otherwise it will not unfold. So habitat design we will be doing for elders, we will be doing for children, and what we're understanding is that the quality emerges as a result of the interaction between the person and the space. So you can take a curious child, or as it turns out, a curious professional, and drop them in a lockdown, non-curious environment. What happens? We blame the person because they have no curiosity. One of the things we will do in healing arts as we go forward is habitat design, life work planning. And it says, what space do you need to enter to be the next phase of what you want to be? How many of you watched the movie Megamind? Anyone? You know, I'm always intrigued. Sometimes the people who write scripts for movies embed a stunning amount of wisdom. Now, it's the exception rather than a rule, to be sure. But if you look hard enough, there are examples. And one of the fascinating things that animated movie brings out is you can get caught. You can get caught in the life of the hero. You can get caught in the life of the villain. I hate to say too much now because I'm going to give it away since so few of you have seen it. But, okay, I'll give a little bit of it away. One of the characters fakes his own death in order to reinvent himself. Well, there's a little bit of wisdom in that. Sometimes there are parts of you, just because you don't have a gift in expression does not mean you do not have it. It may mean the environment you've been in never supported it. It never called it forward. It never enabled it. And you will think it is not there until you are in a different space. And so part of how we accelerate our growth is we want to be in spaces that evoke different aspects of who we are in rapid succession. Put another way, if you still do the same thing you've always done in the same way, you will die, and, you know, sometimes no one ever notices. Because you're still walking around. Your eyes are still open and you're still breathing, but, you know, it's all, everything that matters left, because it was bored. The highest aspects of yourself say, you know, I'm getting a little tired of this. I think I'm just going to take a little vacation. I'll check in 5 or 10 years. A great exercise, by the way, is to design an ideal day for yourself. One day. You know, we spend a lot of time designing the ideal retirement, the ideal house, the ideal whatever it is. What about the ideal day? What would your ideal day have? And let's make the question a little more pertinent here. Suppose that this ideal day was your day, day after day after day, in some way, right? We actually did this as a family one time. My brother and I had gotten a little too focused on, we were thinking that we needed to buy this piece of property and build this new house, which thankfully we never did. But I remember my dad saying more like, what kind of life do you want to live? What would best support that? Would you want to be on vacation for your life? Probably not, right? Every day would have some, segments of things that would make it meaningful. And what we realize is we can bring some aspect of that into every day if we're a little more conscious of it. Last one on the personal side is this. In a large enough context, everything makes sense. And the corollary is that, what? In a small enough context, nothing makes sense. What is the meaning of disease if seen in a small enough context? Unhappy accident, unfortunate situation, derailed my life, bad genes, maybe the result of bad behavior. Those aren't very empowering storylines, are they? Seen in a larger context, maybe it is the thing that puts our life on a different course. It can be. My husband had chronic myelogenous leukemia and went through 2 bone marrow transplants, and there were many times when we thought he would not make it. And I remember being aware. Have any of you ever been aware when you've been dreaming? You're a lucid dreamer. You know you're dreaming as you're dreaming. Okay, from that you can step out into all kinds of other things, and I was aware at that level. And I was talking to John about the fact that he was dying. And the thing I will never forget is that in that part of myself, I was completely neutral, completely peaceful. I will never forget that, because then when I woke up, I was a wreck. I was like, he was everything to me. I mean, this is my life. It could not be any worse. What is a crisis to our personality may be of very little significance to our soul. And the soul will do whatever it takes to bring us to deeper awareness. My husband did make it. He was close to the edge, but he did make it. And he now looks back and realizes that he would not be today who he is, were it not for some of what he released and some of what he let go, and different ways that he began to think about himself and everything else that really mattered through that really 10-year experience. Not all encounters with disease end that way in terms of having such a happy conclusion, but that's the point, is that there's a possibility. There is a way in which we can see things in a vantage point that makes sometimes a lot more sense than when we see it when we're caught. It's like the mazes, a real maze, not a labyrinth, where you're bumping into the dead ends and the blind alleys, and you can't tell where you're going unless you're looking down. To me, the bottom line of this is that you accept where you are and say, I am where I am to learn what I need to learn. Because I don't understand from the level of the maze. I will never understand everything. And you kind of get this unexplainable, many of you have probably felt this, kind of peacefulness about situations that on the surface may be extremely challenging. It was in the early 1800s, and there was a monastery where people came to live as part of their spiritual practice. It was in France. And a man lived there, an older man came to be part of this community, and he was the personification of difficult. He was irritable. He was messy. He was always getting in fights. He wouldn't do his share. He wouldn't clean up. I mean, he drove this community crazy. No one got along with him. And it was tough for him too. So finally one day, he left. He decided he was going to go to Paris. Well, the leader of this community chased after him when he realized he was gone and found him, caught up with him, and tried to convince him to come back. But it had been too hard, and the old man said no. Well, kind of his hand being forced, the teacher offered him a very large stipend if he would come back, a sum of money that he would be paid every month. I mean, how could he say no? So he went back. Well, when the community got wind of the fact that not only was he back, the old man, but he was being paid while they were being charged a lot to be there, they were livid. They all came together and they were confronting the teacher with this, and he just started laughing. He said, "This man is like grist for the mill." He said, "Without him, how would you ever learn about patience and compassion and tolerance?" He said, "That's why you pay me. He said, and so that's why I hire him. Some of what we most want to escape sometimes plays a really pivotal role in a larger context. All right, let's move to the organizational level. In a whole system design, there are no losers. Someone else's loss is the same as our loss, just as painful, just as much to be avoided, and cannot be a victory. We have the greatest thing here in Colorado. It's the only demonstration like this I know of in the United States. In Grand Junction. Is anyone here from Grand Junction? Yes? Yay. I won't have you tell the story. But in Mesa County, in Grand Junction, years ago, the physicians got together and they said, we don't want any one or two of us or five of us to become the Medicaid docs. So the physicians who treat the poor often end up taking all of them, and the other physicians in many communities don't take any. And the physicians who take most of the Medicaid patients are often called, the Medicaid docs. So they said, what we're going to do is we will agree to share the load. And no matter whose office the patient comes into, we will average the Medicaid rate with the commercial rate. They actually own in that community their own health plan, and the physicians refuse to sell out. It's another fascinating story. So they said, we're just going to take the Medicaid rate and the commercial rate and average it so that effectively we are all carrying the load. By the way, Medicare cost in Grand Junction and other healthcare costs compared to the highest cost health communities in the United States, a third. A third. They learned how to think as a whole. Not easy, but essential. One of the things I always remember my dad saying as I was growing up is win-lose always turns into lose-lose if you play it long enough. Wow. Absolutely true. We have to think in a different way. I think the hidden story, the great untold story of evolution, is the story of greater and greater circles of cooperation, where cells, even smaller than cells, but cells, become tissues, to become organs, to become organ systems, to become people, to become families, to become tribes, to become communities. That there are holons within holons that have greater capacity as they come together to specialize and to collaborate in bigger circles. That's the way we'll build future organizations. We're not quite there yet, but we're coming. And there are places that really rethink the boundaries. This will not be easy for us because we're so used to thinking competition is essential for our economic system. There are motivators greater than win-lose. We'll get there. But it requires us to see each other in a different way. Mark Gaffney's wife, his name is Janice, many years ago she was a student at dance therapy at NYU. And she did part of her practicums, part of her work in what was then the locked psychiatric unit at Bellevue Hospital. And it was one of her very first days there, and she went to leave after doing the dance therapy work, and she saw the guard there at the door, and she asked to be let out, and he kind of looked at her and smiled, and he said, "I can't let you out." And she said, "Oh, no, I'm not a patient. I'm here doing this dance therapy. My name is Janice Gaffney, and actually I'm late for class, and I really need to go." And he looked at her and he said, "Yeah." He said, "And I'm at Harvard." She realizes she's not getting anywhere with this, and so finally she turns around to find the attending physician, the physician who was in charge. And upon hearing her relate this, he kind of looked at her and he said, "Janice, why were you asking a patient to let you out?" You know, that's a mistake we all make, or at least it's easy for us to make, where we look at the other organization or the other country or whatever it is and think, yep, competitor. To see each other as allies, to see each other as part of larger systems is what it will take for us to release the largest circle winds as they are in Grand Junction. Now, we are getting there out of necessity. Right now, there are 10 pharmaceutical companies, all competitors, who've actually banded together to share data, do research, form a not-for-profit to bring, in this case, pharmaceutical drugs to market more effectively and less expensively. They know it's in their interest. That's one of 100 examples. It's happening in every single sector. We're actually seeing also collaboration, not just at that organizational level, but at the individual level. So it must have been maybe 2 years ago, in the journal Nature, which is one of the harder-hitting science magazines, there was an article that had 57,000 contributors. Now, you don't list those all by name, because that requires a whole other journal. What had happened? 57,000 people using a gaming technology had cracked one of the challenges that we have in protein folding. They did actually what some of the leading scientists had not been able to do because of mass collaboration. And the result of their work, the decoding of this protein, was published in the journal Nature. Collective intelligence is ultimately where we go. I mean, right now we're really as smart as our individual mind. Where we finally go is we are as smart as our connections. We are as powerful as our connections. That's why, again, I think your new identity has it right. That's where we're actually moving. Money matters, but meaning and contribution matter more. Nasruddin was eating chickpeas and bread. It was the poor man's food. Meanwhile, his neighbor was dining sumptuously in this grand house on these fine delicacies that were provided by the emperor. And the neighbor said to Nasruddin, "If only you would learn to flatter the emperor, you wouldn't have to live on chickpeas and bread like you do." Nasruddin said to his neighbor, "Yes, and if only you would learn to live on chickpeas and bread, you wouldn't have to flatter and be subservient to the emperor." Part of what happens in our journey toward wholeness is different things matter. Money will always be a part, but it's really a bit of a different equation. I'm going to come to that in just a second, but just as an intro to that, we are seeing now more organizations that are held together not just by money, but by meaning, where people work oftentimes as volunteers to give of themselves just because of the sheer thrill of participating. Can you think of some? Oh, what, you? Very close to home, huh? Well, Wikipedia, right? That beat out Microsoft's Encarta. I mean, who can even remember Encarta? But it was a significant competitor at the time. All the economists thought Encarta was going to be the global kind of encyclopedia. They had paid staff and paid managers and teams of paid writers, and all bets were on Encarta. And then came along Wikipedia. There are lots of organizations like this, and one of the movements toward wholeness that's happening in organizations is they're realizing that if money becomes the only thing, if it's unidimensional, and if it crowds out larger sources of meaning, it doesn't work for us very well. So, in Sweden, this blood center, they had women who had come who were interested in volunteering. 153 of them interested in giving blood. A third of them were told, hey, it's just voluntary. A third were told that for their coming, they would be given a small sum of money. And a third were told, hey, I know this isn't why you do it. You did it because you want to do good, but we're offering this sum of money, and if you would like to do 2 good acts today, here's this charity that you can contribute it to. Now, traditional economic theory says, who is going to go ahead and give the most blood? Economic theory is clear on this. Money should add extra incentive beyond people's, intrinsic desire to do good. So it was a little surprising when it came out like this. The group who was told it was just voluntary, 52% went ahead and gave blood. And the group who was given the money, but it was made clear it didn't displace the primary motive. See, it's not that money's bad. They had the highest contribution, but the group where they were treated as if money was the thing that was motivating them to had the lowest participation. Now, there are hundreds of studies like this, some testing very high-level rewards, up to 5 months' salary. That's a big kind of bonus or incentive, not incremental. Some also test penalties. So, for example, a daycare center in Israel had a problem. Parents were coming late to pick up their kids. And so they figured, we know how to solve this, we'll just put a penalty. Every time one of those parents comes late to pick up their kids, we're going to fine them. They had to stop this experiment because so many parents were now coming late to pick up their kids. That's right. They took the intrinsic desire to do right by the people who were taking care of their kids, and they turned it into a transaction. The feeling like I can just buy extra time. So the number of patients the number of parents who were coming late doubled over the very short course of this. To the set, they said, we got to stop this experiment. This is not working well. Yeah. How powerful would our organizations be if we designed for all of the things that provide meaning, not treat people like human ATMs? That's a whole organization. If you're interested in this, here's a couple of great resources. They're both superb. I love the title on this one, Punished by Rewards, The Trouble with Gold Stars, Incentive Plans, A's, Praise, and Other Bribes. And Daniel Pink's book, Drive, is great. Essentially what they look at is, yes, there's jobs where money's the thing that matters. They tend to be jobs that don't have intrinsic meaning. But as soon as you move into professional areas, it's a great study. All right, I'm going to touch on a couple more, and then we're going to move into the planetary. Potent innovation requires us to serve that which is greater. I'm going to move kind of quickly through these, but these are such great stories. I can't remember if I ever shared either of these with you when they were first starting, but this Aravind Eye Hospital, have any of you ever heard of it? Couple. Extraordinary. Started by a physician who at the time was 58 years old, mortgages his house to fund the first 11 beds. He is driven by the desire to solve the problem of the 12 million people in India who are blind. 80% of that is needless blindness. It can be prevented and it can be cured. And he said, that's what I want the rest of my life to be about. I'm going to find a way. And so he does. And he says, and in this clinic, he built this clinic with the explicit design principle that 3/4 of the surgeries would be provided free to the poor, that they would be profitable with 1/4 paying patients. By the way, they have a higher return on capital than we have here in the United States in most of our health systems that are for-profit. It's extraordinary. And they have no debt. That's incredible. Completely redesigned the way they do the operating theaters. Their surgeons, on average, are doing 2,600 surgeries a year. Here in the United States, we're usually between 150. Sometimes you'll see it bump up into the 200s. Incredibly efficient. They had a problem because the lenses that they were importing from the West, the interocular lenses, at the time were like $200. Well, you translate that into Indian currency and this kind of, innovation mandate, and it wasn't working. He ends up, through philanthropy, building his own manufacturing plant where they make these lenses at a grand cost of $5 each. They export to 80 countries, which they still are. This is the largest provider of eye surgery now in the world. They do about 300,000 surgeries every year. There is a cardiac equivalent of that, which is this place started by Dr. Devi Shetty. He was the personal physician to Mother Teresa. And what he came to understand, highly trained, some of the things he did were first in the world. He has incredible technical acumen. But what he understood is that it's cost that kills. So he has been doing essentially the cardiac equivalent. Every paying patient there covers 2 who cannot pay. Countries are importing their patients now. About a quarter to a third of their patients now here are coming from Asia. Asia's putting patients on planes because it's so much less expensive. They have teamed up with the largest health system now in the United States. They will be building these health cities around the world where the stated intent is to cut the cost of care by half. The thing that has struck me doing futures work is that the highest level innovation comes from people who see what they do as a spiritual service, as a spiritual path. Because they ask different questions. Kind of the question of that monk. What do they really need? Not, is this going to erode my other service line? Not, does this maximize profit, even though they end up being very profitable? They just ask different questions. And I think this is intrinsic to how we must innovate going forward. Lastly, on the organizational side, our organizations are not going to be any more whole or any more wise than we are as their leaders. And the most remarkable stuff I see coming out from places where they didn't have to, they didn't need to, they chose to. Quick example. This is a health system I have great regard for because of the kind of questions they ask. One of the questions they ask is, what do we do in any way that creates harm? And they started with things like infections and all the usual stuff, but then they went further and they said, what happens when you turn on a light switch? Well, what happens is that a mountaintop somewhere is removed for the coal, which is burned, which becomes particulates, which drops down in the rivers and the streams so that now women of childbearing age and young people across a very large section of the upper Midwest, going clear up into New York, are advised not to eat the fish out of these rivers and streams. They calculated their own impact of energy use at Gunderson Health System and figured that it accounts for about 500,000 pounds of particulates every year. And they said, this doesn't sound like do no harm to us. And so they are driving now initiatives through which they intend to be energy independent. And by that, they do not mean purchasing green energy credits from the electric companies. They mean renewables they own. That's what they mean. By next year. It's been quite a path. They, for example, on one of their northern campuses, they pay the county a little more than $100,000. They take the methane from the landfill, they pump it. It's a little more than a mile to where the clinic is. They save $600,000. They heat and cool their entire northern campus from methane from that landfill, which was just going up into the air. In La Crosse, which is where their largest clinic is, they're doing a similar thing with the brewery. It is great. Conservation, when they built their new building, Jeff Thompson, the CEO, says to the architects, I want this to be energy efficient. The average energy consumption of buildings right now is 254 kBTU per square foot. And the architect said, well, we think, maybe we could get that to 200, 180 if we adopted everything we can think of. Jeff says, I'm thinking more like 115. That incessant focus on conservation now, which they put about 2 million into, they generate 1.2 million year after year after year. But they had to create it. They did it because they had a will to. All right. I started early, so I'm going to end early, which is going to be in about 15 minutes. But I want to end with this because the highest kind of level wholeness really is planetary. And I think we start to understand that the earth reflects our consciousness in our vibration. It's not going to be any healthier or more whole than we are. What's inside us and what's outside us are the same thing. There is no inside and outside. If tomorrow we were to wake up and change the fundamental way in which our emotions circulate the planet of greed and hostility and aggression and all the stuff that circles around the planet, and we were to instead establish a tone of love and concern and empathy, we would wake up in a different world. Absolutely. Different world. Physically, literally, not just emotionally, not just energetically, physically. The world we see and experience, from the weather to the type of species to what we can actually perceive with our senses, because what we perceive is a very small part of what's out there and is in fact a measure of our vibration, if you will. Same thing that happens with patients when, as they move to a different type of wholeness, a different vibration, their life reorganizes. This is the same thing at a planetary level. Number 2, nothing is inanimate. Nothing. Nothing is unconscious, and nothing is unable to relate. We have to get over our primary narcissism, which says that we are different. We are on the earth, but not of the earth. We are not like the plants and the animals. We take tours. We have gardens, but we are not one with. A whale is different than we are. For the longest time, we thought animals have no emotion. There was a time when we really thought animals didn't feel pain, believe it or not. And there are some people today who don't think plants feel pain. To really understand a thing, we must be one with the thing, as you know. That is the essence of what you do. Does a tree have memory? Absolutely. Do the rocks remember? A lot further back than we do. Could a plant become our ally and even produce medicines and compounds that we need for the healing? Absolutely. We don't know how to partner because we think we're sitting on top of the thing. We actually think we can prosper no matter what happens to the whole. Everything is intelligent. It's smart all the way down and all the way up. Is a cell smart? Oh, yeah. Is a virus smart? Mm-hmm. Turns out we have trouble matching them because every time we make a move, they make a move. We get a little better, it gets a little better. You're going to tell me a virus isn't smart? Keeping up with us. One of the fun things we are seeing now, we will see more in our lifetime, those of us in this room, is interspecies communication. We're starting now with dolphins and the intelligent species. But we will finally get it that it's all intelligent, maybe differently intelligent. We can communicate everywhere. Planetary cycles and returns are accelerating. This just means that we're going to have opportunity to learn more quickly because the impacts, the returns are getting faster. So what used to take a decade or 2 decades now happens in years. And what happens in years will happen in months. Until we come to awareness. That's the beautiful thing. The whole thing is structured so that we can learn, so that we can become aware. The question is just kind of, how costly does that need to be? But it's a fun time to live because everything we do will now come back with such greater speed. And lastly, a change in one thing changes everything. The most hopeful thing of all. Because you look out there and you say, man, that is so big. I mean, how are you supposed to do something about whales and dolphins and, dying oceans? And it feels in many ways so overwhelming. But because it's all connected, every time we change, it ripples all the way up, all the way out, all the way down, all the way through. The quality of your awareness, of your vibration is what matters. Quality in this case matters a lot more than quantity. So we will, as we fall in love with that greater whole, we will recreate in extraordinary ways. I think we'll discover more of the essence of who we are. We're going to create different kinds of organizations, and ultimately we'll start to understand and relate to our planetary systems differently. All right, one last story. A little stream emerged from its origin high up on the mountain, and it flowed down the mountaintop. Sometimes it would leap and bounce. Sometimes it would kind of just drift along lazily. Sometimes it would go underground. But never did it meet an obstacle that it couldn't overcome. Until one day, it came to the edge of a vast desert. The stream thought to itself, just one more obstacle, I will move through this just as I have everything else. And so it flung itself into the desert that it was very quickly swallowed up, and its waters disappeared into a small trickle, over and over. The stream was determined, and it thought to itself, if the wind can cross the desert, surely the stream can cross the desert. The sky seemed to echo back those words. The wind crosses the desert, so the stream can surely cross the desert. And so began this conversation between the stream and the sky. The stream said, I know I must cross this desert, but no matter how hard I try, I don't get any further. The result is always the same. The sand swallows me up. The sky said, oh, you can't cross the desert the way you met everything up on the mountain. No, here you have to let the wind carry you across the desert. The stream was a little bewildered. It said, how can the wind carry me across the desert? Well, the sky said, you must let yourself be absorbed by the wind. Well, the stream wasn't liking this at all. Be absorbed? Be absorbed by the wind? Well, I mean, I'm a stream with a unique identity and form, and if I was absorbed by the wind, I would lose myself in all of that. Well, the sky sensed the stream's fear and tried to reassure it and said, this is what the wind does. The stream was not convinced. the sky described how the wind could pick up its vapor and carry it across the desert and let it fall again as rain on the other side. But the stream was unconvinced, and it said, but I wouldn't be the same stream. I wouldn't be this particular stream. The sky understood this dilemma, but it also understood the mystery. And it said, if you let yourself be absorbed by the wind, you will discover your true heart. Your essence will be carried, and you will fall again on the other side to become a stream that flows in new ways, a stream that you can't even imagine from where you're standing now. Trust the wind. Trust me. Somewhere deep in the stream's memory, it had a recollection of a wind that could be trusted, of a horizon that was always out of reach, but was always a new beginning. And so it took a breath, and it surrendered to the wind. And the wind rose up the vapor, carried it gently in its arms, high above the hot sand, far upon the horizon, and dropped it gently where it fell upon a new mountain. And the stream understood a little more about what it really was, more about the wholeness of what it is a part, and more about what it really meant to be a stream. That is the journey. That's where we're headed. That's what we discover every time we release, every time we step into something that's new, every time we push through that boundary and we discover there's a whole other mountain, there's a whole other world on the other side. Blessings.